What's up guys, Asian here again with a build video, and today we're going to be going over the Templar healer. So the Templar healer is still one of the strongest healers in the game right now. You're probably going to be seeing Templar healers being used across endgame trials, both progression and endgame guilds, simply because Templars bring one of the strongest utilities in the game in terms of resource return via shards, as well as the only consistent source of minor breach and minor fracture through power of the light. So Templar healers are definitely still a mainstay in endgame trials, PvE trials. So definitely want to have a Templar in your group as at least one of your healers. You might not necessarily need two Templar healers, but at least one is always a good option to have in a trials group. So like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, attributes, CPs, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build. We'll be kind of discussing the different substitutions that you can make, because healers are a support role in ESO, and so that does require you to be very flexible when it comes to skills as well as sets. So I will be going over a couple of scenarios where you would be using certain skills, as well as a different set that you might be asked to wear depending on what your second healer is also wearing at the time. And then of course, because support roles don't really have what's called a rotation, I'll be going over kind of how I approach healing, my healing philosophies, as well as kind of give you guys a little bit explanation as to why I take healing with this certain approach that I do. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So this is, again, only one of many different combinations that you might use. Now we'll go over all of the different sets that you should pick up as a healer. These sets are going to be sets that are used pretty much across the board in different scenarios, and I will kind of try to explain the scenarios where you would use certain sets. So starting off first with our Monster Helm set. So we're going with Bogdan, the Night Flames. This is probably one of the better Monster Helm sets. There's really only 3 Monster Helm sets that healers are going to be able to run in Wrathstone. They haven't really changed too much, so it's going to be Bogdan, which is what we have here. We have Earthgore, and then we have Rkugamz, and I'll go over each of those in just a little bit here. So starting off with Bogdan, that 5-piece, even though it only has a 5% chance to proc, it is a proc that has a chance to occur at every single heal. So let's say you're using healing springs, you heal 6 people, that's 6 independent chances for Bogdan to proc. So even though it does say 5% chance, it actually does end up being significantly easier to proc Bogdan, especially if you're using those AoE heals like Combat Prayer, healing springs, and so on, especially if you have a healing over time ability like Mutagen and 4-man content. Bogdan actually procs very, very often. It also is a pretty decent heal. It's a pretty small radius, only 5 meters, but that's not that difficult to kind of work around, because most instances you will be stacked up, your DPS will be stacked up in trial scenarios. So that is one option here. Notice that I do have a heavy head and a medium shoulder. I'd like to have 511 on my healers, so that's basically just for the additional resources from the Undaunted passives. You can go with all light if you would like for the additional sustain that you would get from the light armor passes, so it's kind of up to you whether you want the additional sustain or you want a little bit more resistances and a little bit more resources. So that's kind of up to you to decide there. For our body set, this is going to be Olorime. Olorime is still very much the meta for healers. You pretty much always want at least one of your healers to be wearing Olorime because of that major courage. It is definitely superior to Spell Power Cure when it comes to application of major courage. I have the perfected version here. You can go with the imperfect version. It's kind of up to you. The imperfect version is obviously a lot easier to obtain compared to the perfect version. You always want to have Olorime as your body set if you have the perfect version, so that way you maintain that max Magicka on the 5-piece as well as that Magicka regen. It's less important if you don't have the perfect version, because you don't have that max Magicka on the 5-piece, but you still kind of want to try to keep it on the body if you can, just for that additional Magicka regen on that 4-piece bonus there. You'll notice here that all of my pieces are divines. You can go with Infused large if you would like. I do also have Prismatics on my large pieces for the additional health and stamina. It really helps out your survivability as well as your ability to use break free and things like that. So again, you can go all divines, or you can go with Infused on your large pieces here. Then for our second set, I have Infallible Aether. This is what I like to call a back bar set. So healer sets can basically be broken up into body sets, which are worn on the body, and back bar sets, which can be worn on the back bar only. So Infallible Aether is another very classic staple healer set, especially in endgame score running guilds for that minor vulnerability that you get from that 5-piece. The other bonuses don't really help you out all too much when it comes to pure healing. They're helpful if you kind of want to do a little bit more DPS as a healer, that minor slayer and spell crit and spell damage. Spell damage also does help out your healing a little bit here, but it's really that minor vulnerability from that 5-piece that makes Infallible Aether really shine. So even though the text does say fully charged heavy attacks, as long as you start to channel a heavy attack on your lightning staff or your resto staff, you will be able to apply minor vulnerabilities. You don't need to fully charge the heavy attack, you just need to start channeling it in order to get that minor vulnerability proc going. For our weapons, I have the Master's Restoration Staff here. You do have a few options. You can go with the Asylum Restoration Staff, or you can go with Infallible Aether in this instance, so whatever your back bar set happens to be, your second set. So it's kind of up to you. And then for your back bar, we have the Lightning Staff Infallible Aether. This is obviously going to be your back bar set, or your second set, your not body set. So let's go over let's start going over jewelry traits and enchants first, weapon traits and enchants, then we'll go over our kind of set substitutions that you can make here. So in terms of jewelry, you'll see that I have two different traits here, and these are probably going to be the most common traits that you'll see on healers. So you have Infused and Arcane. Arcane just boosts your max Magicka, which helps boost your healing strength, as well as your sustain by giving you more resources to work with. Infused increases your jewelry enchant effectiveness by 60%. So you can go with any combination thereof. Some healers just go all arcane, so don't have to transmute anything. Some healers do a combination of the two. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. For your enchants, again, you'll see I have two different enchants, spell damage and Magicka regen. These are the two most common enchants for healers. So Magicka regen just helps out with your regen, obviously, and then spell damage helps out your healing strength. So again, you kind of want to pick and choose which ones you kind of want to play around with. If you need more regen, then obviously go with the Magicka recovery glyph. If you need more healing power, then go with the spell damage glyph. So just kind of pick and choose depending on which sort of combination you have. So all the different gear combinations that you're going to have obviously have different 2, 3, and 4 pieces. So for example, Olorime gives you 2 additional Magicka recovery armor bonuses. So you might not need to spec as much into Magicka regen when you have when you are running Olorime, so you might be able to put in more spell damage glyphs, for example, to help offset that kind of spell damage reduction there, because with this particular combination you don't really have any additional spell damage except for that 129 from Infallible Aether there. Then for our weapon traits and enchants, very similar to jewelry, you do have a few options here. So I have an Infused Absorb Magicka on this particular Master's Restoration Staff, but there are other combinations that you can go for. So you can go for Powered for additional heals, you can go with Decisive for more ultimate gain, so you get faster Warhorn uptime. So you can go with Defending if you want a little bit more survivability. You can go with Nirn, which boosts your Magicka damage, which improves your DPS as well as your healing power, so that's another option there. So you have a lot of different options when it comes to your Restoration Staff trait. Same thing for enchants. I have an Absorb Magicka enchant here to help out with sustain a little bit, but there are other options. You can go with a shock damage enchant to help with concussed uptime, although that will typically be on your back bar. You can go with a weapon damage enchant to improve your healing strength by giving you some more spell damage. You can go with a weakening enchant. This is more for progression groups where you might want to decrease the damage incoming to the group, so you have that weakening enchant to reduce incoming damage. And in some instances, you might even be asked to run a crusher enchant. Because of the changes to one-handed enchants, tanks, their sword and board enchant is now half strength. So while your tanks might be learning to basically use your staff or bow back bar, you might be asked to run crusher just to maintain that high crusher uptime, to maintain that full strength crusher there. If you are going to be running crusher, you typically will be using Infuse as your front bar there. The crusher enchant typically will not be used all too much for those kind of score pushing guilds. It'll probably be used more often in progression guilds or sort of beginner guilds where you might have tanks running double sword and board, or your tanks are not very comfortable running a staff back bar and have low uptime on that crusher enchant on the back bar there. That's where you would use that crusher enchant. But the rest of the enchants obviously have the uses: weapon damage for if you need more heal, absorb magicka if you need more sustain, shock for additional off balance uptime. Now for your back bar for the lightning staff, I highly recommend picking up charged as your trait for the additional chance to apply status effects, and pair that with a shock damage enchant. Shock damage procs concussed, which is required to proc off balance. So you need to have that shock damage concussed in order to get that off balance procced. Off balance is very important, particularly if you have a lot of stamina DPS in the group. Most deep stamina DPS, if not all stamina DPS, will have that Exploiter passive under the Ritual constellation under your CP trees. That gives them additional 10% damage done to off-balance enemies. Magicka DPS typically will not have this passive, so it's less important to have a charge with a shock damage enchant if you're running, for example, 8 Magicka DPS. But if you have a lot of stamina DPS, you do want to make sure to have as much off-balance uptime as you can, so you do need to make sure you're proccing Concussed very often. It also helps out because Concussed does also apply minor vulnerability as kind of a secondary effect. So if you're not able to get very good uptime with Infallible Aether, or you're not running Infallible Aether at all, having that shock damage there to help proc Concussed and help improve minor vulnerability uptime is also very useful to have as well. So that's pretty much it for all of your traits and enchants. Let's go ahead and talk about any sort of replacement sets. So we'll start off with the Monster Helm sets first. So I already mentioned Bogdan here. This is my personal favorite, but you have two other options. You do have Earthgore. Earthgore is a very bursty heal. So you heals for a very, very large amount over 6 seconds, but the cooldown to kind of bounce this out is over 35 seconds. So as a result, Earthgore does have its uses. It's a very powerful healer set, but it's not generally, I should say, it's not useful in all scenarios. Bogdan is one of those sets that you can use pretty much in any scenario, and it's going to be good no matter what. Earthgore you could use in all scenarios, but there are definitely some scenarios where it's going to be a lot weaker overall, particularly in instances where you want more consistent heals rather than a quick burst heal. You'll find Earthgore used a lot in the mini trials, so that's Cloud Rest and Asylum, because burst heals is more important there to bring people back up to full from Baneful Mark in order to help heal the tank after Storm to Heavens or after a big Ohms hit. So you'll find Earthgore used more often there. Other set that I mentioned was Rkugamz. So this is kind of a set that you would use if you have a lot of stamina DPS. So you really won't see this used in Cloud Rest or Asylum because those tend to run very heavy into Magicka DPS. But Rkugamz does restore stamina to everybody within 5 meters of wherever it happens to proc. The heal itself is weaker compared to Bogdan's, and that's just because it also restores stamina, so it's kind of a balance that way. It lasts for 8 seconds and it can proc every 15 seconds. So this is more used, again, for groups that have a lot of stamina DPS to help out their sustain. So you can pick this up, but in mini trials like Cloud Rest and Asylum, where you don't have that many stamina DPS, Sentinel obviously loses out to Bogdan because even though the stamina is nice to have for Magicka DPS, it is not their primary damaging resource. So you're better off running Bogdan or Earthgore instead for that addition, for the stronger heals that those two Monster Helm sets provide for you. Now let's go over the other healer sets that you might be asked to wear. So I will typically categorize them into body sets and back bar sets. So body sets are sets that you want to have active at all times because the 5-piece is not a proc, something like that needs to be active at all times. Back bar sets, on the other hand, are sets that you can run on one bar because the effect is itself a proc, so you don't necessarily need to stay on that bar in order to maintain that 5-piece effect. In those instances, you would be able to run something like the Masters or the Asylum's Restoration Staff instead. In terms of whether you want to use Asylum Restoration Staff, the Master's Restoration Staff, or your back bar set Restoration Staff, that's kind of up to you. The Master's Restoration Staff does give additional stamina with every initial tick of healing springs or illustrious healing. So that's obviously very nice, especially if you have a lot of stamina DPS to help out sustain. The Asylum's Restoration Staff, let's see if I can find it here. The Asylum's Restoration Staff does give you additional sustain after you cast Combat Prayer, so it reduces the cost of your healing abilities for 3 seconds after you cast Combat Prayer, so it's very useful to help sustain. Most people who run the Asylum's Restoration Staff will do Combat Prayer followed by 3 Orbs. The first 2 will get that reduced cost. That third one is just in case you manage to get it off before the 3 seconds expire. So Asylum Restoration Staff is there for sustain, Master's Restoration Staff is more for stamina sustain, and if you don't need either, then you can go with your back bar Restoration Staff instead. So in this case, Infallible Aether or any of the other sets that I'm going to mention shortly. So the first set that we're going to go over here, just find them, is going to be Mending. So Mending is a body set. You want to maintain it on your body at all times. This is going to be used more for progression style guilds because it reduces the damage that's incoming to the group. Even though the effect does say weapon damage, it actually reduces all damage for PvE. PvE mobs use 1 damage stat to calculate their damage, so it doesn't really matter that it says weapon damage here. Now, the downside of running Mending is that you do need to be within 10 meters, and it only lasts for 3 seconds. The good thing is, pretty much most of your healing abilities are considered area effect heals, so you will be able to proc this very easily, but you do have to be within melee range in order to get it to proc. It's also not useful in certain fights like Rakat or Cloud Rest, where most of the more damaging moves are actually environmental effects, so Mending does not affect those, so in those fights you probably don't want to be running Mending at all. Next set is going to be Jorvuld's Guidance, so this increases the duration of all your major and minor buffs and damage shields you apply to yourself and allies by 40%. Note that for the damage shield, it's duration, not strength, so if you have a 10,000 damage shield that lasts for 10 seconds, with Jorvuld's, it's still a 10,000 damage shield that just lasts for 14 seconds instead, so it's duration, not strength for the damage shields. Jorvuld's is not really as strong on a Templar healer compared to on a Warden healer, because Templars generally don't give out major and minor buffs. The only minor buffs that you give out to the group would be minor sorcery from the Dawn's what is it, Radiant Dawn passive, I forget what this skill tree is called. That's really the only minor buff you give out. It will improve the duration of the minor Mending buff that you give yourself, but it doesn't improve minor breach or minor fracture uptime from Power of Delight, because that is a debuff, not a buff. So that's you don't really see Templars run Jorvuld's. It's typically worn on Wardens instead, because Wardens have more minor buffs that they give out to the group. So you can still run it as a Templar healer because it does affect Olorime. A very classic combination is Olorime and Jorvuld's Guidance. It also helps buff your Warhorn. Your major force uptime from Warhorn is buffed by Jorvuld's Guidance, so that's really the strength of Jorvuld's, to help buff that major force, to increase it from 9.5 seconds to about 13 seconds instead. Jorvuld's can be either a body or a back bar set, so it's kind of up to you. If you have Warhorn in your back bar, then obviously it's going to be a back bar set, so that would be the instance where you would run Jorvuld's as a back bar set. That's not a set you want to run, that's not a set, that's a set. There's a couple more here. Sanctuary, this is kind of a niche use set, so it increases healing received for pretty much everybody within 10 meters of you, up to 12 people, which it does include you. So Sanctuary is overall not that useful in most scenarios, and that's just because it's very easy in ESO to overheal because of all of the healing done modifiers you have, all of the minor Mending uptime you have, particularly on a Templar. So it's very easy to overheal, so you don't really need Sanctuary. 12% healing received isn't really necessary to kind of heal everybody up to full and keep everybody topped off on health. But there are instances where you might need to use Sanctuary. So for example, in Rakat hard mode, because Mending doesn't really work all that well because most of the damage there is environmental, some healers will be running Sanctuary instead, just because it gives at least some sort of utility. For Cloud Rest, a lot of progression groups will also be running Sanctuary for the additional healing received to help get out of Baneful Mark during Execute. So Sanctuary is a set that you do want to pick up, but it is not used quite as often as the other sets. It's not a set, and the final set that we're going to be talking about is going to be Worm. So this reduces the cost of Magicka abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other members within 28 meters of you. So this just helps out Magicka sustain. Obviously, if you have pretty much all stamina DPS, then you don't really need to run Worm. If you want to run Worm, you still can. It definitely helps out your tanks and your healers, but it obviously will not be helping out any stamina DPS at all. This is obviously a body set just because you do need to make sure to have that 5-piece active on both bars, not only on one bar. Sanctuary is also a body set, as you can imagine, because you do want this to be active on both bars and not one bar as well. So those are the other healing sets that you might be asked to run as a healer. Moving over to our character sheet now, I am a Breton. Bretons are one of the best races for healers right now. The other race that you might want to consider running is Argonians. Bretons have the advantage of having more max Magicka, so they have 2000 max Magicka. They have additional spell resistance, so that just helps out your survivability a little bit. Plus, they have 7% cost reduction to all Magicka abilities, so just a very, very strong passive boost there. Argonians, on the other hand, do have 6% healing done, so they have stronger heals overall. They have less max Magicka, but they do have that max Magicka bonus there. And they also have what's called the potion passive. So whenever you drink a potion as an Argonian, you gain additional resources. So you gain Magicka, health, and stamina back up 4,000 every time you drink a potion. So if your standard potion restores 6,000 Magicka, it actually restores 10,000 Magicka instead. So it's actually a very strong bonus there to sustain as an Argonian on top of the additional healing done for the additional power. So as an Argonian, you don't need to necessarily spec as much into spell damage because you have that 6% additional healing done that way. In terms of Mundstone, you have two options. I'm going with the ritual here to increase my healing done just because I run more Magicka regen in this particular build. You can swap this out with the other Mundus, the Atronach, which improves Magicka regen, so it's really up to you which Mundus you want to run. Both of them are perfectly fine to run. And then we have Clockwork Sisters Fillet as our food. So this gives us max health, max Magicka, and Magicka regen. You can replace this with Witch Mundus if you would like. You should only run this if you have Prismatic enchants on your large pieces, because you do end up getting lower health compared to your other foods that you might want to run instead. So for example, blue food or Orzgard's Red Hrothgar. So you do need to have Prismatics if you want to run Clockwork or Witch Mundus. The advantage of running Clockwork or Witch Mundus is you do get additional max Magicka to help out your sustain as well as your healing strength, but you do lose out again on that health and Magicka regen. The other food that you might want to consider running is Orzgard's Red Hrothgar. This gives you more health, it gives you 5,000 health, and it gives you more Magicka regen, 459 Magicka regen. So that is your other option, but typically speaking, I like to run Witch Mothers or Clockwork for the additional max Magicka, but it's up to you whether you want to give up that Magicka regen and max health for that max Magicka bonus. Now going over to our skills, so there are going to be a couple of flex spots here, and I will go over them once we kind of go over what I have set up here. This is kind of my generic go-to setup. Energy Orbs, Healing Springs, Combat Prayer, Power of Delight, Extended Ritual, and Solar Prison. And for our back bar, I have Luminous Shards, Ellie Drain, Blockade of Storms, Channeled Focus, Overflowing Altar, and Aggressive Warhorn. So there are a few flex spots here, but there are definitely some skills you don't want to swap out at all. Energy Orbs obviously don't want to swap out. This is your strongest heal in the game right now in terms of pure heals per second. Healing Springs, you can go with the other morph of Healing Springs, which is Illustrious Healing. Illustrious Healings will give you a little bit more heal power, but you do lose out on sustain. But if you're able to sustain without the additional Magicka return from Healing Springs, Illustrious Healing is a very good option as well. Combat Prayer you pretty much need to maintain if you have non-Nightblades in group, because this is the only source of Minor Berserk that you can give out to other people. If you have Wardens or Nightblades, then you might not need to run Combat Prayer because they have Minor Berserk built into their class abilities. Power of Delight. If you have a Templar in group, you don't need to run Power of Delight because Power of Delight is typically run by the Templar, but you can still run Power of Delight regardless, because they do stack on each other to help improve Minor Breach and Minor Fracture uptime. But if you don't have a Templar, you will need to run this in order to get those debuffs active. Extended Ritual is very nice to have for the Purify synergy, but this is technically a flex spot. It's a very nice heal over time that you can keep on ticking, as well as provide everybody with that Purify synergy in instances where you might need like a Purge in a fight, but you can swap this out for some other abilities as well. Solar Prison is for the major main. This is just kind of a default ultimate you can go for. You can obviously swap this out for a different ultimate if you would like, and again, I'll go over these once I explain the back bar options here. Luminous Shards, pretty much a mainstay. You do deal some little bit of DPS, but it's mainly for the synergy there that restores resources. It restores both Magicka and stamina, so it's very, very nice to have. The advantage of Shards over Orbs is that it's pretty much an immediate cast, and you can target where you want it to go. Orbs does take a little bit longer to kind of get to people, so if you want to get resources to the tank right away, then you want to use Shards. If you just want resources just to kind of be floating in occasionally, then you're going to want to go with Orbs instead. Ellie Drain is a mainstay for the Minor Magicka Steel and Major Breach. Blockade of Storms for the off balance. Channeled Focus is your sustain bonus. And Overflowing Altar. Realistically, you only really need one person to run Overflowing Altar in the group, just to apply that minor lifesteal and for the Blood Feast synergy. So you could be running this, but if somebody else is already running this, then you don't necessarily need to run this as well. So you can drop this for another skill. And then Aggressive Warhorn for the Major Force. Not an ultimate that you can kind of pass up. Now in terms of other abilities that you can run instead of these flex spots here, so again you have one flex spot on the back bar with Overflowing Altar, you have one flex spot on the front bar with Extended Ritual, so you have up to 2 flex spots, and your ultimate on the front bar is also flex as well. So you can run Breath of Life or Ritual of Rebirth. I would run one, but not the other. Ritual of Rebirth these are both basically burst heals. So Breath of Life is a single target burst heal, as well as heal one other person as well. It's a little cheaper to run than Ritual of Rebirth. Ritual of Rebirth is also a burst heal, but it heals multiple people at once and also heals one other person outside of the radius. The radius is 10 meters. I personally prefer Ritual of Rebirth, even though it is a little bit more expensive. I can basically cast it and heal multiple people at the same time versus Breath of Life, which is pretty much only a single target heal. So I personally prefer Ritual of Rebirth over Breath of Life. You can also use Practice Incantation from this skill tree as your front bar here. The danger of running Practice Incantation is that it is a channel, so you can't move. You can get out of the channel early by blocking, but then why are you running Practice Incantation anyway? So that's just something you want to keep in mind there. You can run Mutagen. This is more used for 4-man content because for 12 people you have to cast this 6 times if you want to hit everybody, which is not a very efficient use of your time. So this is more used for 4-man content. You can use the other morph as well, Rapid Regen. This is very, very nice heal over time, plus I prefer Mutagen just because of that additional cleanse that you get if for whatever reason somebody falls below 20% health. You can also use the ultimate here. Light's Champion is the one that I prefer. This gives major force and major protection. Again, this is more used in 4-man content, less so in 12-man content, but this is a nice kind of bursty heal. It basically heals 9,000 health every 1 second for 5 seconds, so really, really nice burst heal, single target burst heal, so you can use this on the front bar, your Resto staff bar here. If you're running content that needs a shield, then you can obviously run Annulment, any of the morphs, may have been Magic or Harness Magicka there. If you do happen to need a source of major vitality to the group, you can run Bone Surge. This is only really useful again if you're stacked with the group, as you can imagine, because you need to be pretty much next to somebody in order to use a synergy. This is really I've only really seen this used in Cloud Rest for the major vitality bonus to help get rid of Baneful Mark and Execute. Don't really see it being used really anywhere else. Another ultimate you could use is Reviving Barrier. It's a very, very powerful damage shield. In this case, it's almost 27,000 damage shield, so very, very strong, as well as additional heal as long as the shields are up. Then, if you need to have Purge, you need to run Efficient Purge, obviously, so you must have this ability active as well. Those are basically your options there for skills, both ultimates and active skills. Now moving on to our champion points, the CP cap has been unchanged between Murkmire and Wrathstone, so the cap is still 810, which gives us 270 CPs to put across each of our different constellation types. Starting off with green CPs, I have 75 Arcanist, 75 Tenacity, that leaves 120 points to put really wherever you'd like. I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord, but again, you can kind of divide them up however you would like, depending on what sort of content you're running. You can also push Arcanist and Tenacity up to 100 if you'd like, and that will give you 70 points to kind of play around with instead. For our blue CPs, the two most important nodes are obviously Bless for healing done and Elfborn for critical heals. So you do want to make sure to get these as close as you can to 100. So these are the jump points just below 100 points, 75 and 81. This gives you a little bit more points to put into other nodes. The other blue CP nodes are more geared towards DPS. As a healer, you typically will not be DPSing too much, but if you're kind of in endgame score progression groups, it's going to be more useful to put 75 and 81 into Blessed and Elfborn respectively, and then spec a little bit more into damage. So I have 43 Ellie Expert, 25 Spell Erosion, 23 Master at Arms, and Thaumaturge as my particular setup here. And finally, for our red CPs, this is kind of a very generic approach. For each specific piece of content you're going to be running, there is kind of an optimal red CP setup to kind of maximize the reduction that you are getting. So you do need to adjust your CPs accordingly depending on what content you're running. So I have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Alright, so that is pretty much it for the build information. Now let's go ahead and talk about the healing philosophy, how I approach healing. So healers and tanks, because they're support roles, you guys don't really have a rotation. It's more about what are you prioritizing instead. So healers have 3 things they need to kind of prioritize: buffing your allies, debuffing the enemy, and healing your allies. So obviously as a healer, healing allies is pretty important. You don't want them to die, but if you are able to maintain heals, like you have several orbs going out, you have healing springs, don't forget you also have 2 healers as well. You should also be buffing and debuffing as well. So your most important buffs and debuffs that you want to prioritize maintaining: Combat Prayer, Power of the Light. Those are probably going to be the 2 most important ones you want to maintain. Combat Prayer for the Minor Berserk. If you have a lot of Nightblades or Wardens in group, you might not necessarily be running Combat Prayer. But if you don't have if you don't have Nightblades in group, or you don't have Wardens in group, then you still want to maintain Combat Prayer for the Minor Berserk, Power of the Light for that Minor Breach and Minor Fracture. The other move that you're going to want to maintain is going to be, at the very least, you want to maintain Ellie Drain for the Minor Magicka Steal. Very helpful for Magicka Sustain. Blockade, because off balance does have a 15-second cooldown, so it's 5 seconds off balance, 15 seconds cooldown. You don't need to maintain this all the time. I would recommend trying to maintain this as much as you can, just so you have your backbar enchant continuously ticking, but it's not necessarily important to maintain Blockade of Storms indefinitely or 100% uptime. Channel and Focus is something that I would highly recommend you practice getting 100% uptime on. 1, for the sustain, but 2, it is a source of your major resolve, major ward, which increases your resistances, so that helps out your survivability. As a healer, you want to stay alive, so try to get this up as much as you can. If you have a couple of seconds drop, that's not a big deal, especially as a healer. You have very good Magicka sustain, but you just kind of want to try to maintain this as best you can. And then for me personally, I always try to have an orb out in the group. Just because you want to have it going. Again, it's your strongest heal. In terms of heals per seconds, Orbs is the strongest move in the game. So I like to have at least one orb out at all times, just so I have that heal ticking. If somebody pops an orb, then I just throw out another one. That's pretty simple there, because the orb does not obviously heal if it's popped. If it's popped, it disappears, so you don't have the heal going on there. Surprisingly, I do not actually use Healing Springs all too often as my primary heal. My primary heal is typically Orbs and Combat Prayer, as well as Extended Ritual if I'm using that for the additional hot as well. Minor Lifesteal is a very nice debuff to maintain, but again, you might not necessarily be the one running Blood Altar, so if you want to maintain it, you can. Blood Altar does last for a very long time when you have a fully leveled, 32 seconds, so you don't need to really keep an eye on this all too much, because it's every 30 seconds you would have to recast this. So that's kind of my approach to healing. I tend to prioritize buffing and debuffing. I heal as much as I need to, but again, because I try to have at least one orb out in the field at all time, I already have my hots going. Plus, Combat Prayer kind of doubles down. It both buffs and heals, so it's nice to have that going. So my approach is, you let my orbs, let my Extended Ritual, let my Minor Lifesteal do the healing for me. Trust that my DPS will be able to stay out stupid, and basically prioritize buffing with Combat Prayer, buffing with debuffing with Infallible Aether, and Power of the Light. So that's kind of my approach to healing. I do have a few videos where I have healed. I don't think I've healed too often on my Templar healer, but there might be 1 or 2 streams, old streams that I have where I healed on my Templar healer. So be sure to check those out if you kind of want to see an example of how I approach healing that way. There are also other streamers and content creators that I would recommend checking out for healing. I don't typically heal that often, so my healing gameplay is not necessarily the best representation of how you should heal endgame trials. I recommend checking out Heals to Feels, Tabata, and Style Anima. Those 3 guys are pretty much the top end healers, probably the best healers in the game right now. They heal for very high end PCNA and PCEU guilds, so I would highly recommend checking out those 3 streamers: Heals to Feels, Tabata, and Style Anima. So that is pretty much it for this build video. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Hope you guys found this build video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.